Labor, the weekly Labor caucus meeting. Fair bit of discussion around the issue of constitutional recognition. As you may recall, a few weeks back, the Minister, Ken Wyatt, announced that they would like to hold a referendum in this term of Parliament, but while he was more open perhaps than some within the government, the Prime Minister quickly made it clear that would not include actually enshrining in the Constitution an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Well, today in the Labor caucus meeting, the Labor Senator Pat Dodson fired up on this. He said, this takes us, quote, back to pre-Uluru, and that's a serious matter. Constitutional recognition is now decoupled from everything in the Uluru Statement. The government's now shifted to co-design with select individuals. The Minister has a plan for consultation with the government backbench and Pauline Hanson. Well, Senator Pat Dodson joins me now. Thanks very much for your time this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
Sounds like you're fairly concerned about the approach the Minister's now taking.
I am concerned that we seem to be drifting yet again and that the high hopes of the First Nations could be dashed unless there's some clear leadership from the Prime Minister on this, supporting his minister to deal with the serious concerns and aspirations that we've been hearing about from the Uluru Statement. You know
Ken Wyatt, you've known him a long time. Have you spoken to him in recent weeks about where this process is going?
We've had a meeting with Ken, and he's a very genuine, cordial human being. This is about the politics of dealing with a long-standing concern about the recognition of First Nations in the Constitution and of dealing with the question of the voice to the Parliament and of dealing with the Makarrata Commission, that is, of truth-telling and of agreement-making.
So to be clear, if there's no reference in the Constitution to this voice to Parliament, are you saying it's just not worthwhile?
Well, there's a bit of water to flow under the bridge, and I give the Minister some licence in relation to that because he's talking about a co-design process. We don't know what that is.
What does that mean?
Well, that's a good question because we don't know what that means. We don't know with whom, and I'm concerned that First Nations peoples in the regions will be left out of that, and maybe a select few people get to be consulted about the design of the model and any other set of words that may be used to substitute for the voice going into the Constitution.
But if he's consulting you and Linda Burney and Labor, what is the position? That voice to Parliament must be referred to in the Constitution?
Well, there's got to be the free, prior and informed consent of the First Nations peoples. It's fine to have a chat to me and Linda Burney. We're pretty cognisant of how the system works, and we know of the concerns that people have raised. We know of the challenges of getting successful referendums through the Australian public, but it's got to be something that the First Nations have supported.
So how do you know that? What should the process look like to ensure that there is that buy-in?
Well, we've been told for the last 3 or 4 years that the best process in Christendom has happened, and that culminated at Uluru. And out of that then came the propositions that we've been all struggling with to try and get through.
Do you accept, though, those propositions, as well-intentioned as they may have been, didn't include a lot of detail around what the voice would do, how it would be constituted, what matters it would deal with?
I accept that was part of the problem for the voice to the Parliament. And there was a review, of course, that Julian, Lisa and I co-chaired, and we came back with the concern over that. But we did come back with a clear concern that there ought to be regional entities or regional voices to convey to the Parliament matters that concern people in the regions, as well as be the sounding boards for what would constitute a national voice or any words that may have to go into the Constitution.
But just to be clear on this point, it seems one of the big sticking points is whether you do refer in the Constitution to this voice, whatever it looks like, or not. Are you saying that is still something up for negotiation, or is that pretty clear where Indigenous Australia's at?
Well, it's not up for a negotiation from the Indigenous Australians' point of view. They're still wanting security. This whole question of the constitutional entrenchment arose because of the history of governments getting rid of entities like ATSIC, the NAC, the NACC. So this question of dismissing a voice to the Parliament when it's not okay with the particular party.
It's got to be in the Constitution.
Well, it's at least got to have the security of the Parliament, of the constitutional backing. It may not always be the best remedy because we know things in the Constitution are subject to government's either using them or exercising them as powers.
But there has to be some reference there.
There has got to be some clear reference that we are shifting the relationship and that there's an intention by the Australian people that this ought to have the nature of some permanency about it.
But this is the fundamental problem Scott Morrison has with it. He says it won't be there in the Constitution.
Well, that's his problem, and he's the leader of the country. And we're in turmoil because we're not clear what his minister is trying to convey to us when he talks about referendums and co-design processes and whom he's consulting with.
So if it's something short of that, if it's simply some reference to, you know, first Australians have been here for 65,000 plus years, that's not enough.
Well, that'll be subject to the consent of the First Nations peoples. If they believe that's the best they were going to achieve under a Morrison government, well, Labor will look at that seriously.
So you are still open to bipartisan support for a minimal
Well, we're open to what it is the First Nations people consent to in this mishmash approach that's been developed.
Does that mean you'll have to do your own consultations all over again with Indigenous?
Well, I would hope not. I would hope not. Look, this has gone on for far too long. I think Australians are fed up with it, quite frankly. And I think that the Prime Minister ought to listen to what's being said through industry, through lawyers, through community people, that we as a nation, it's time for us to embed the constitutional power that gives some security to a voice to the Parliament, being enacted by the Parliament, subjected to the sovereignty of the Parliament, which would only be would be non-justiciable and would be advisory only. So what's complicated about that?
And what's your message to Indigenous Australians who might be feeling it's time to protest over this, it's time to oppose the direction the government's heading in?
Well, I think another 3 years of talk and hot air is in the hands of the minister. If he does not bring we've got the Garma Festival next week, and I'm not sure whether the PM's going to that, but he should go to it and he should make clear what his government's position is. If after Garma we're not clear, then I think the First Nations people will become very restless.
And you'd back them in protesting about this?
Absolutely, and I'd back in the Australians who are sick of this procrastination process.
Final one, Barnaby Joyce's idea, which is a little bit different, obviously, to the Uluru Statement idea, but he suggested having regional-based senators. Each state still gets 12 senators. You carve the state into 6 regions and have 2 senators from each of those regions. He says that way you would have senators from the Kimberley, senators from the Cape, senators from Indigenous areas. What do you think of that idea?
Well, he's talking about representation. He's not talking about recognition.
Yeah, it's different.
It's a different concept.
Is it a good idea?
Well, I think there's merit in it, and it ought to be explored. But you know, and I think that. But let's not confuse what it is about. It's about representation.
It's a different thing.
It's a different proposition. And if we had had that at the start, well, instead of the obnoxious concept we had in the Constitution, which had to be removed in 67, about not counting Aboriginal peoples in the reckoning of the numbers, and we may have got somewhere to this. So we've got a history of denying First Nations to elections to our parliaments, but also to their recognition. So this is the big chance the Morrison government's got to do something that's constructive, that will be minimalist, really, and that will have the backing of most Australians. And it's really in his court, and to support his minister to go out there and start the process of co-design with First Nations peoples and bring concrete things back in so that the public can understand what this model will look like and how it'll work and how it's going to affect the lives of First Nations peoples.
Labor Senator Pat Dodson, thanks very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you very much for having me.